Immediately. Okay. We are live and the link is on. Okay. So in this video that Jonathan shared, the rabbi there discusses he discusses the inconsistency, so to speak, in Maimonides, where it seems that on one hand he's saying it's really only the 7 that you could keep, and then later on it seems as if one could keep on more. And he talks about the specific words that are used, that according to some opinions, he gives the example that there's only 7. And as we discussed earlier, what does that mean? Only 7? We had 10 that end up turning into 613. So we have 7, the Noahide 7 that could be expanded to more. This distinction he makes is really the tension of someone feeling obligated or not, which we discussed a little about that. There are women in Judaism that could keep some of the commandments that they're not obligated to because they're time bound. They could keep them, however, their reward, so to speak, is different than one that is commanded to do so and not. And the rabbi there was stressing the point that he finds it difficult to believe that a Noahide will take on more and more commandments just because it's as if recommended, or he wants to take on more than the 7, and at some point not get confused that he feels obligated to do so, and then it starts getting into confusing area if someone's doing something because he thinks he's obligated to do so or not. What I wanted to highlight specifically is that he mentions this, how there are various opinions and differing opinions within the rabbis that discuss this. And we have to understand, and we'll touch about this later on in the chapter 2, that disagreements in Judaism, or a disagreement for heaven's sake, is not something that we need to be scared of. That is something that is part and parcel of the whole live conversation that's been going on for 2,000 years. And while in some sense it's not the ideal, because we are obviously trying to connect back to the source, over the last 2,000 years, it has turned into an ideal that we have this lively conversation. And obviously God has many aspects to him. So in a certain sense, all these different opinions, in a certain sense, all at some point converge into one, where we don't have, obviously, the capacity to fully understand all these things. And that's why, specifically to Noahides, there isn't a consensus with this regards whether Noahides could keep more or keep just the 7 or take on more. Some say it's just the 7. Some say they could take on more. And that's why it's super important to identify a rabbi, obviously. And I mentioned this earlier, while I'm not a rabbi, I'm obviously happy to discuss more in depth if anyone has questions, and then also relay this on to Rabbi Shirky or Rabbi Goldberg that are involved with Brit Olam, and have a joint conversation. So there's obviously access you guys have to rabbis, but there's nothing wrong if you're looking for your own personal rabbi. And the reason that's important is because ultimately it was decided a long time ago in Judaism that because we don't have a central authority, that we are relying on the rabbi's guidance. And the rabbi that I'm going to go for guidance is also aware that there's another rabbi in China that has a different opinion. But both of them understand this to be true, and that's all within the frame of the game that's quote unquote being played. And as long as you're asking and you're being truthful and vigilant about getting your answers from the right source, then you have who to rely on. And again, just in very short, because we spoke about this last time and we'll get into more in depth, but when the study of Torah comes into mind, the Lubavitcher Rebbe and others discussed how that they supported Noahide studying like complex theological concepts, and even support of like the commandment of circumcision and others. And obviously there's charity, and even the study of the concept of God many times requires you to learn other concepts and aspects. So one rabbi will be like, you could read book A. And as I'm reading book A, I get to a word that I don't understand. So now I need to read book B about word X. And then on and on, I could start expanding more and more. There's obviously is a question with regards to Jewish festivals, which we could get into later on, where there is more agreement there that that's not ideal. However, I want to end just this little clarification with regards to this video, that even the contradiction within Maimonides in Laws of Kings, later on, as I mentioned in the intro, in the laws of the sabbatical years and the Jubilee, chapter 13, paragraph 13, that's where we have that beautiful quote about that not only the tribe of Levi, but any person of the inhabitants of the world that wants to take on and feels his spirit is motivated to understand God in a better sense could, reach the holies of holies. And this would seem in contradiction, obviously, to someone that's like limiting it just to the 7. And again, to clarify, the 7 clearly expand to more details. The question is, even if the 7 turn into 110, are those 110 commandments, or are they obligations, but they all reroute you back to the 7? Which in Judaism, you have 613, and each one is specific. You could have one of the 7 that turns into another 20, but if you didn't observe one of those 20, one of those subcategories, you're only liable for basically you're liable for not observing one of the 7, and not, let's say, 13 or 20 that it would be in the case of a Jew. And we'll discuss this a little more in depth in chapter 2. One more note, just to cherry on the top, so to speak. When the Maimonides uses the word inhabitants of the world, this is the same line that the Sifri, one of the Bible commentaries, discusses how the world had 3 crowns. There's the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of kingship. And he says how the crown of Torah is available to all inhabitants of the world, which is the same terminology that the Maimonides is using. So this too is another indication that it's not so clear. And again, this is part of a larger conversation that we're having, which is, for many, many years, the Noahide conversation was not happening. And in the last 30 years or so, it's becoming a lot more lively, all the way till this moment, right now when we're speaking. And as this continues to grow or reach a critical mass, I'm sure there's going to be changes. More rabbis will get involved, other opinions will coalesce, and even Noahide sages will emerge. So this is still a dynamic conversation, but what I was hearing from the rabbi's speech seemed, he was very adamant about his position. But it's to clarify, if anyone sees that and then is wondering why did Chazi say there's more options. It's just, first of all, Chazi's not saying, I'm mediating what I understand from my rabbis, of course. But like I said, there are various opinions. Did I confuse you guys more or clarify?
Clarified.
Jonathan, specifically because you saw the video, any thoughts?
Neither. Like, I'm not more confused, but there's a lot more to, I think, dive into. But yeah, I mean, like, I wasn't perturbed by it, but for what it's worth, I kind of knew already that there was a plethora of opinions, and a lot of that video too is like a Q&A with individual questions that kind of got into the weeds a little more. So
right. All right. So chapter 2, Jonathan, can I ask you to take us into the depth of God?
Sure. So let's fundamental principles. Number 1.
Let's start with number 1.
The will of the Creator is revealed to human beings through the conduit of prophecy.
Right. Okay. So we have the will of the Creator. So first off, I think the word will is the proper term over here, and we don't have to dive too deep into this, but there's a sense where the world can be seen through the eyes of God's wisdom and through the eyes of God's will, so to speak. And God's wisdom is us noticing that this big universe that's mysterious, but yet it seems intelligible and organized. but there you don't necessarily have to think that something was planned. Rather, it's more of like a giant puzzle, and that's why people like scientists or philosophers, they dive deep into this, and the more they learn, or let's say we'll look at Aristotle as a certain like apex of that school of thought, which gets to recognize God through wisdom. However, God's will, it has to do more about this unstoppable force of desire that we could look at the world at and see this endless light of God, this infinite light shining everywhere, and that has to do with God's will, and that we see through prophecy. Okay, and so while we know there's certain mechanics of the way the world works, the prophets come and tell us what God is expecting from us within this world. So we don't want to just be looking at the world through wisdom. We want to be looking at the world through God's will itself. And the Torah and the prophets are letting us know that this is what God wants, and less in the attitude of this is what while yes, this is being demanded from us, it's not the yelling father. Rather, it's the child that wants to understand better what his father wants from him and wants to do his best to do that so they can recognize and know each other better. To those of us that are married or we're in relationships, we know that it's less about telling our wife or telling our spouse or significant other what to do, but rather trying to understand what is it that they want, and then meet them where they are. So that is what God is asking from us and inviting us to do. There is a Tehillim, a Proverbs, that says Bechol drachecha da'ehu v'hu yiyasher orchotecha. So in English it would be in all your ways you should acknowledge him and he will give you a smooth path or a smooth walkway. And the idea is that understanding God's will is in all aspects of life, whether it's we're praying or we're learning the Torah, which would be seemingly obvious that we're learning God, but that's also from studying science or walking down the street or looking at our child or talking to our child. In all our ways, we should try to understand what God wills from us in those moments. So I could decide to be a good citizen and raise my kid in an ethical manner, and then I could add another level on top of that, which is how specifically does God want me to interact with this kid as well, on top of those, we'll call them like those basic moral understandings. And even when I'm studying science, I could decide to look at science just through my wisdom eye, but I could also understand and look at science through God's will as well and see what am I supposed to be doing with this science. Yes. Okay. So number 2 is the ultimate prophetic revelation is the giving of the Torah from heaven by God. So this is stressing the point of how public Sinai was. This is a discussion that I saw. I don't know if it was with Trey or Buzz, not Baz, Buzz online about. There was a comparison being made to the apostles talking about the resurrection, I think, and the hundreds of thousands or millions of people that witnessed Sinai. And I'm not going towards the midrashic understandings or interpretations that like everyone died and came back to life or all time stopped, but more about there was this great revelation that happened to a very significant amount of people, and that continued on and on and on. In our synagogue on Simchat Torah, which is the day we celebrate finishing of the cycle of reading the Torah. So the rabbi in one of the years gave out everyone in the congregation like these little notes, and on it said, "My name is X, my rabbi was Y," and every single person in the synagogue read it. So it took us like from Moses to Joshua on and on and on and on and on, all the way to like the rabbi in the shul. And the idea was to show that like we could trace the lineage back, so to speak, and our tradition back all the way back to Moses. And that's why all these people, what they told their sons, it would be a very large lie to try to keep under wraps, so to speak. So that is the core in a certain sense. Questions, comments? All right. Hala, onwards. Whoever claims to be a prophet sent by God to instruct humanity must first be directed towards the sages of Israel in order to determine his authenticity and the degree of obligation to listen to his words. Okay, so we see over here too, this is sort of bringing us into the world of dealing with the false prophets, so to speak. So this also relates back to section 2, which is we're saying if the prophet comes, we're going to look at him through the oculus of prophecy and the guidelines that we got through prophecy, which were at Sinai, which include the Torah. So once we have that line, we're always coming back to that point. And that's what guides us. So we're going to be looking at all these things. The prophet comes, it's very nice. You're doing magic. You have a great name. You have great hair. We first have to put you through the test that the Torah and the guidelines that the Torah gives us. Now, I should mention over here that a false prophet doesn't necessarily mean an evil person, and it doesn't necessarily mean that he does not have prophetic powers. There's a question of whether he's false for the Jewish people, right? So there will be like the classic things he does if he tells us to change things, or he just tells us to deny some verses or understandings that we have in the Torah. So that would be very easy for us to say no. But what if he's like just a great guy that has prophetic powers, but he's talking about things that are not related to us, or we see that for Jews, this doesn't make any sense. Would this turn him into necessarily an evil person or an evil entity? And should he be completely shunned? So an example we have for this is Bilam, right? The famous prophet using the dark side of the force, right? So we know that this is a real occurrence. And the Torah gives us a whole accounting of him and the king Balak and his curses and his fails, but there's a whole conversation in literature just about Bilam. In a certain sense, the Torah is letting us know that, hey, Jews, specifically at this point, recognize that there's another conversation going on out there with the rest of the world. And potentially there's other prophets over there that people could be talking to. Rabbi Cook famously discussed how it is not unreasonable to think that other world religions would have their own prophets. And again, the distinction would be about false prophets for Jews and false prophets, generally speaking. But there is room to see where some of this can happen. There's a rabbi named Rabbi Netanel Payumi. He was a contemporary of Maimonides, so roughly like 900 to 1,000 years ago. He was a judge in the Jewish courthouse in Yemen, and he was highly regarded by Maimonides. He has a whole book talking about how Muhammad is a prophet, and he uses the Quran as a divine text to strengthen his position with regards to the Torah, its authenticity, and Judaism. So it's a radical take, so to speak. But there too, his attitude is as long as we see Muhammad or the other prophets at a lower degree than Moses, and as long as they're referencing non-Jews, so there isn't such an issue over here. But here specifically, the Torah is talking about how Jews and Noahides, which, as we discussed earlier, are Orthodox Gentiles, if they're connecting themselves towards the Torah of Israel and Sinai through prophecy, as we see in section 2, then they need to be wary about the false prophet. And just to mention, in Deuteronomy, the terminology that God uses is, for God is testing you. So, like, if it was very easy to know that this guy's a joker or not relevant, it's no test. It becomes a test when seemingly there's something there. There's a discussion there. And one last note to think about over here is there's the famous story of Daniel, which we Jews read on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And it's a fascinating story because the whole story of Daniel is the mission Daniel has to do with Gentiles. It has nothing to do with Jews, right? It's the king of Nineveh. He has to go talk to them. And even there, the stress isn't, and generally in the Bible, the stress isn't to the Gentiles that they have other prophets or they're worshiping other gods. That is not what they necessarily have to change their ways in. So God has, and as we'll discuss later on, there is seemingly more flexibility with these theological questions when it comes to the relationship between Gentiles and God and the certain mediation they need. So Daniel was sent to Nineveh not to tell them, like, don't listen to false prophets anymore, or don't be building altars. That wasn't his discussion. His discussion more about acting in a moral sense. Perhaps that the people of Nineveh, maybe they require some sort of low-level idolatry to connect back to God. But that's happening in their world and potentially permissible in a certain context. Number 4, Anthony, Antonio, I'm sorry, can I trouble you to take us there?
All mitzvot, divine obligations that are consistent with ethical norms, common sense, and proper conduct are obligatory for Noahides.
Right. So this, obviously, this sentence right over here, this paragraph over here opens up, obviously, a lot of options. Because the second you're saying, so things that are ethical and common sense and proper conduct, we also have to do this as well. So in Jewish terms, rabbinic terms, what we're talking about over here is derech eretz, right? The way of the land. And what we say is derech eretz kadma la Torah. This is a prerequisite, or this is, in a certain sense, the undergirding of the Torah. And we said that there was different opinions, like Rav Yosef Albo, for example, who talks about how the 7 are a base and you build on top of that. So here too, in a certain sense, even though we didn't dive into the 7 themselves yet, it's letting us know that definitely for Jews and also for Noahides, while they have their 7, right, they have their mitzvot, but undergirding those mitzvot are all those general ethical norms and proper conduct that has been known them. So it's here too, we see already an opening where it starts becoming more than just the 7. Okay. 5, non-Jews may not institute new mitzvot of religious character by themselves without the approval of the sages of Israel. Right? So what are we saying over here? And in a certain way, we also touched upon this in my little brief introduction. So this is also a specific wording that Maimonides use, that meda'atan, on their own accord. But the rabbinical sages, they have jurisdiction to potentially give them more obligations or other things to do. And this relates back to the question of when there's a consensus, when this reaches a critical mass. As this progresses, rabbinic authorities might take on more responsibility and more involvement in this world. But that's for them to do in a certain sense. While there's places for the Noahide sage, there's a point over here that there still needs to be some sort of recognition from the authority of the Jewish rabbis. And this also relates to this one of the mitzvot, which we call dinim, which is building courthouses. And like I said earlier, that's something that was really only possible once Israel became a nation again, because there's some sort of body that you could relate to and talk to as well, that has some sort of governing body as well. Number 6, advancement of civilization, including technological progress, expansion of knowledge, moral elevation, and concern for the health of all creation, is an underlying principle in the world functioning in accordance with God's will. So, beautiful section over here. So, we're told over here, basically, we're not supposed to live in the past. I'll use the example of the Amish, or in a certain sense, even in the ultra-Orthodox community, not all, there's a certain sense where we feel like, these advancements in technology and in society are, they are moving further away from the core, or what, the Israelites experience, or the real sense of what Judaism is. But Judaism isn't locked into a certain time in history. Rather, it's eternal. And the more we dig and the more we search, the more we find that it's relatable to things we have day to day. And while it's true that Judaism, and definitely since the exile, reacts in a slow manner. It doesn't decide on its own accord to just renew things. Rather, reality changes and the Torah reacts. So, electricity comes in, and hydraulics come in, and the Industrial Revolution comes in, and slowly but surely the Torah has to react to this. Sometimes it's a slow reaction because we don't have the proper shoulders or rabbis to make these decisions. Sometimes you have those rabbis, they just don't have enough information or are not aware of enough information. For example, many times it requires the right rabbi to speak to the right doctor to understand and speak the proper jargon, and then he could actually give you his proper understanding. But he might be thinking, the rabbi, as wise as he is, he might be thinking that that we'll use a concept of, let's say, IVF, for example, let's say for procreation purposes. The rabbi might think that this is very problematic, but once he has a conversation with the experts, he might see, okay, I understand now what's going on over here. And now that you've illuminated this to me, I could come about this from a different angle. So while, of course, we have to understand, and this verse, this section over here is telling us, bring in the neuroscientist, bring in the philosopher, bring in the psychologist. However, going back to God's will, always be looking at that through the rabbinic context, and the way God is expecting you to take on these things. So he's expecting you to take the doctor seriously, but then see how that applies to the Torah. And sometimes there are things that could be changed. There's a question of politics involved. So there is a question with regards to, in Judaism, with certain dishes that you use, if they become non-kosher because you put meat in a milk dish, and how one relates to this. So for many years, the conversation, or for generations, the conversation is kebol'o kach polto. The way it absorbs, that's the same way what's the opposite of absorbs? It not deflects. I'm Israeli. You guys got to help me out over here. The opposite of
I'm not good with my antonyms.
Yeah, so
I'm just gonna say releases,
releases, right? So like if they're, this piece of this pot over here, this clay pot, it absorbed the hot milk. So once it's hot again, it would release the milk again. And the idea would be, let's say I used it for hot milk, then I poured it out, and then I put in hot meat. Once the hot meat heats up the walls of the clay pot, the milk particles will come out and then make it not kosher. However, with today's pots and the physics which they're made out of, you don't really have that issue anymore. However, for rabbis to now decide that, like, you know what, you don't have to worry about that anymore, it's very difficult because A, they don't want people to get confused. B, there's political pressure that's around this as well. So there is an exoskeleton of exile that is slowly but surely being removed in a very surgical manner. Or if you want to look at it as an analogy, as like a web, right? So it's very difficult in a 2,000-year web right now to know if I cut string A, I'm not affecting 7 things down the line. That doesn't mean we should refrain from doing so. And it doesn't mean that that people should have a conversation about it. It just means that it takes time. So, and I'm sure you guys heard me talk about this, about clearly halakha is going to have to deal with AI, cloning, all these things that are coming down the line. And the idea is that when we're looking at these advancements of civilization and these technological progresses, so we could just come and say like, oh, this is all great. Rather, the Torah is saying, ChatGPT, fantastic. But one second, how is it being utilized through Torah eyes, right? Am I using it now to, cheat on my exams? Am I using it now to glorify the name of God? Am I making super babies? Or am I now offering all disfigured babies or patients that have been in horrible car accidents? I'm offering them different body parts and things like that. And as a society, can we stress the blessing and pushed aside the evil applications that we could bring from these things. And if you don't have some sort of guide to do this with, obviously it can be extremely confusing.
Does this go back to how you opened? You were giving the analogy of, speaking with your wife or husband. And then you were also, I was hoping we would read I absolutely love the heading over this particular section about God spoke all these words saying, and I know where the text leads, but it ties it into prophecy as if prophecy is a relational thing. So when you're talking from this point of view, I found myself already way back in the first 3 points thinking, how does this relate to last week's conversation about levels and choices? How does this relate to if I happen to drop in on the candle lighting down at the synagogue in Guelph near me? How does this relate to what I do and don't say to people and the assumptions that it has that spreading of, the web that you're describing? And I haven't really thought about that in context of prophecy before, but something about God speaking things into motion relates there to us all. And that's why it spreads out. And that's why I'm thinking, wow, I can take things very simply, but at the same time, if I'm doing them outside of my own house and myself only, I want to think about what I'm saying and how people, what do they expect of me? How do they perceive this? What is my relationship to God in this place where, well, these aren't my people, they're his people. And that could be anybody in any country in the world. And I do think sort of from that place. But everything we do before we ever get into new inventions, touches on this. And we're just making more of them.
Well,
I don't know if I'm saying that exactly what you're saying.
I think I'm understanding. I want to point on some things that you said, and you'll tell me if this is helpful or not. But first off, you mentioned how people perceive you or seeing the things you're doing. Judaism and the Noahide path, we're not looking to proselytize and bring people in. Rather, it's living and leading by example.
Right? I would have said the same thing in a Christian context in church. It's not specifically saying it to choices of Judaism or Noahidism. It's saying it because I am a person God made and I have a responsibility in this world.
Correct. So that is, Judaism definitely stresses that relationship and lets you know that you are being seen. The decisions you make have ripple effects. And the idea is that you are supposed to be that person that is constantly fully embodying God's image and then seen as such. And we see little elements like that in the Bible where, when Jacob sees Esau and all was in proper orientation, he tells him, seeing your face is like seeing God's face, is because we're oriented properly. We're in the right place. We're speaking the same language, and I could see you and you could actually see me, right? Or like when Moses says that he see God's face is as seeing his fellow man. But if one does, and how beautiful it would be if we could all look at each other in that way. Secondly, just with regards to the prophecy element. So we don't have much left from prophecy, but we have the language of prayer, which we're told is, or the silent prayer, which is one of the last things we received from the prophets. And that is, twice a day, we have the top-down conversation, which is, Hear, O Israel. We have the Shema, which Moses tells us, this is a theological conversation from God down to us, because we still have that from Moses. And we then have the standing prayer, the silent prayer from the times of Ezra and the prophets that were involved at the time, which those are some of the terms that we could use that have some remnants of prophetic language that allows us from bottom up to now respond back to God and take part of this conversation. Obviously, that then expands to the proper way of living, whether it's the 7 and its subcategories or the 613. But all those elements are, and back to God's will, we're trying to understand what he wants so we could act properly, be oriented, and then people will see us as people that are representing God, and then that conversation is happening. So when you're asking about a husband and a wife, there are times when I could be outside at an event with friends of mine and I'm going to say X. And then if you look at your wife, you'll see the face where she's giving you, which is like, we're going to talk about this when you get home, because that's totally not what I wanted you to say and not what I expected from you. And the fact that you're looking at me, you know that that's not what I wanted to hear or what you wanted to say. And there's a sense over there where like I forgot that we were a unit, and I'm also having this conversation with her, and I want to understand her will for this relationship. If I'm thinking about myself, just about Chezi, I could very quickly get detached from that relationship. So I hope that answers some of the points you were making.
Yeah, well, and what you just said too, that very much describes that principle that began in the prophetic from Sinai, and it's that. Yeah, it's that back and forth between God and us. And you're describing it in simple terms of, you have that instinct to look towards your wife. She has that ability for you to communicate. And then there's the broader communication when you can dig into it in depth and kind of reorient yourselves to that place where you are one and you're individuals. And I'm like, yeah, that kind of gets at what I was asking.
And we're definitely searching for this. We're all hoping and praying for the return of prophecy, and for this clear understanding and seeing God's presence in the world. Towards the end of the prophetic period, we know of some of the prophets using music to sort of get themselves in that mode. And it talks about how the prophets, the young prophets, the prophet students would go out to the field to collect lights, lelaket orot. And the sense over there is looking around the world around you and trying to identify, where is the light coming from? Where is that point where I could see where God is peeking through, and I could capture that and identify and sort of like, take that little firefly and put it inside your jar and bring it back to you, and recognize if I shake it, if I orient it the proper way, I could actually get light from this. Don't shake and don't capture. This is just a note for any kids that are watching. Don't do that. But yes. Any other comments or onwards? All right. Where were we? We're right. We were finishing section 6. We were talking about God's will, and I'd also just mention that as far as the sources, which we haven't been touching on the footnotes over here, but part of the sources of section 6 is as far as God telling us to be fertile and increase the earth and master the earth. So there's interpretations in mastering the earth. That's what it means, and at least that's what Ramban Nachmanides says. And in Isaiah, God talks about how, I did not create the world for it to be wasted, but rather it's formed for habitation. So all these are invitations, so to speak, for us to rule the world and be involved with it. There is a distinction pre and post flood. Pre-flood, there's more of us ruling the animals, and post-flood, there's more of like a joint understanding. And that's also because, in a certain sense, before the flood, God is looking at the world and saying, like, man, like they're really evil, and they took this mode of mastering the world to a certain extreme where they're destroying the planet and they have no regard towards procreation or the animals. So in Covenant 2 with Noah, the terms over here that they're used with regards to the animals and nature is more of a sort of like a side-by-side relationship where God says, like, you're going to have to show more respect towards this planet for there to be some sort of proper growth going on over here. So that's for Greta Thunberg watching us. We're doing our best, trying. Sandy, do you want to take us on number 7?
Sure. Regarding Noahide laws whose details were not explicitly discussed in the Talmud or rabbinic literature, certain sages of Israel hold they should be decided according to the stipulations of Jewish law. Other sages of Israel hold It is the responsibility of Noahide sages to ascertain definitions of these matters according to their best judgment. Practically speaking, the second opinion is the prevailing one.
Okay, so here too, what we mentioned earlier is a beautiful example of you're going to see in Judaism and downstream from there in the Noahide path, different opinions. And that's not something we need to be scared from. And they're letting you know over here at the end that practically speaking, the second opinion is the prevailing one. And it's also a question about the practically speaking. There's a lot of robust conversation that could be happening in the study hall. And then there's also what I'm doing on the ground. But what we could see over here is what I was stressing earlier is that it's important to locate rabbis. There's also Noahide sages that we're talking about over here. Brit Olam specifically is looking into doing seminars for, because we're not just looking to do this. Rather, we're looking to empower you to potentially either all of you, some of you, one of you turns into a leader of his own community. And for that, there are tools. So you come in for a seminar, they're talking about having like a week seminar, and then they're talking about having like a month-long seminar where it's more intense, but then you're supposed to go back. And like we mentioned earlier with Rav Yosef Albo and Rav Kook, who they see the 7 Noahide laws as more dynamic, and they develop based on the character of the place where they're from, right? So we said like the Chinese Noahides are going to have a different, not necessarily like a different interpretation, but it's going to have a different flavor to it. And Judaism is also interested in that, right? We're not looking for a monolith. Rather, we're looking again for unity through diversity. And there's a sense where God is also wanting and asking, I didn't create Canada or China for no reason, right? Their culture has beautiful things to it. And ideally, the Noahides in those communities are going to take from that cultural wisdom that they have and interpret it and bring it into the conversation and the relationship that they're having also with the Jews and within themselves. And that's why there's room for various opinions, and that's why it's important for the Bombay Noahides to have the rabbi that understands the Bombay culture. And same thing if you're dealing in Canada or in North America, of course. So it also discusses over here, there's the details, right? So the when we said over here, whose details were not explicitly discussed in the Talmud or in rabbinic law, right? So we're saying there is these 7 options, but what does that actually mean? 7 mitzvahs, but what does that mean at the end of the day? So I can't do idolatry. Is that only on a Sunday? Is that on a Monday? Is that always? So we don't have these details. And while in Judaism, we have a tremendous amount of these details, in the Noahide path, we don't have all of those yet. Obviously, we have our Brit Shalom, which is doing a lot of that for us, which we're very thankful for. But the idea is that, again, in each culture, some of those details are going to vary and they're going to change because each one is a little different. Okay, we're going on to number 8. Sandy, do you mind continuing reading?
Okay. Minimum measurements regarding certain mitzvot are as customary as in halakha, Jewish law, such as the size of an olive or an egg as regards blessings over food, are not applicable to Noahides.
Okay, so I'm trying to think what example to use for this. I mean, they use here an olive or an egg. So first of all, just a little background. There's something called shiurim, like these details, right? So if I want to have my cup of wine, we'll take a step back. There's a verse in the Torah that talks about the blessing on food. And in Hebrew, it's v'savata ubirachta. Okay, so as in you felt that you were, what's another word for full if you're eating? You were
Satiated.
Satiated. Thank you. I was going to say, you were satiated, and then you make a blessing, right? So for a Noahide, in theory, there isn't a specific detail there. So the attitude would be, if you just had your pie of pizza and you're satiated, then you're going to make a blessing, as the Bible tells you. In Judaism, even if you're not satiated, you still have to make a blessing. And then there's a breakdown of like, well, what does satiated mean? if I had a piece of bread that's the size of an olive. And what kind of olive are we talking about? Are we talking about an olive for 500 years ago? Because there's a discussion that the olives used to be bigger. That's, we don't have to get too deep into that. Either way, the point is that in Judaism, there's a lot more of these requirements, and the distinction is generally used with sort of the guiding principle for Noahide is more of the natural sense of things. And for Jews, there's like a holiness aspect to it. It doesn't mean that the Noahides are not holy. It just means that the conversation is more specific with regards to the Jews, with specific. I'll use the word. The word is kedusha, but holy characteristics. So a good example that Rabbi Cook brings with regards to an etrog. I don't know if you guys know what an etrog is. An etrog it's like a citron, like yellow citron that we use when we shake our 4 different species on Sukkot. And there's different reasons why we do so. But either way, there's a very big distinction between lemon and an etrog. And they're not considered the same. And for Jews, there's a very big distinction about that. But from a scientific perspective and a natural perspective, they're still within the same family, and they're very, very similar. So in a certain sense, for the Noahide, he doesn't have to make that distinction, and rather he needs to go by what his sages and their understanding of what, let's say, the consensus is with regards to the relevant topic is in the world. For Jews specifically, we have what's permissible and what's prohibited, and that has to do with a specific conversation and relationship that we have with God, which has more specific requirements.
Does that have to... Oh, this is going to sound stupid.
No stupid comments, please.
Does that have to do with the fact that any of those... Okay, I'm going back to your web or your network thing. Does that have to do with the fact that you have potentially 613 places tracking any of those things rather than 7 or 70? And I'm asking that based on this is where it sounds, I'm like, this is going to sound stupid, but I've been having some trouble around eating choices. And I love olives. When I was a kid, I'd get in trouble for like literally drinking the brine out of the olive jar. So lately I've been eating olives again, usually 2. And this morning I wanted 3. And I've been drinking coffee. But when I sit and I think, what am I actually tasting? I'm still tasting olives from, like, literally my tongue is still thinking about olives. So obviously, well, not obviously, but I think there might be a reason I wanted 3 this morning, but I don't know what it is. And when you're getting things like Brit Shalom that's written to Noahides, who have a lot of things very cloudy still in terms of what we know, could this be in the realm of a kindness, because there aren't as many things having to track and we don't have as much information. Therefore, we have a little more flexibility over what we understand and how we apply it, because we're still learning what all the conversations are along that. Or does that just sound really dumb?
That doesn't sound dumb at all. Obviously, during this period of studying and learning, right? And we all want to be learning more and studying more. But during this period, for sure, there's room for quote unquote mishaps or misunderstandings or exploring more, right? So, and you have to be real with yourself. When is that moment when you tell yourself, like, I know what I'm doing. Like, I did understand it, and now I know that I'm going against what I understand. And when is that moment when you're like, I'm still not sure? And at least my relationship with God is I am fairly confident that He is pretty chill. So, like, He's not he's aware of where you're at and what you're thinking about these things. And you could even say that I did know I was doing the wrong thing, but even that, the reason I'm doing that is because, I don't know, as a young child, I was trying, God is aware of all those things. So be real with yourself and rest assured that God obviously sees through it. Mm-hmm. But as far as like a blessing, when you're saying that, it has to do with the relationship that Jews have as a priestly class, where there is a much higher standard. And it's not because like Jews are genetically better, as I've mentioned many times. It's rather like once you're in that group, God was looking for a long time for the people that are going to promulgate his Torah. Once he identified that group and that group took that on, that's the deal. And the sense is like, if you are the eternal people and, you're still here today, the expectation is that, you do so in a genuine and authentic manner. And for that means like, it's not enough that, you weren't satiated. You are the priestly class. So when you're eating food, it's less about whether you're satiated or not. It's more about the understanding is the food was given to you from someone else. You should stop and make a blessing. But the Noahide doesn't need to make a blessing. No, the Noahide does need to make a blessing. And if he's satiated, he's going to make a blessing. But I'm not requiring from him to constantly be thinking about like, I just had this food and it's been 6 hours. That I'm asking from the people that decided to take on this journey with me over the last 2,000 years. Part of that journey also included obviously horrible, horrible things. But another part of that journey is we're still walking hand to hand with him. And it comes with perks and not disadvantages, but responsibilities. All right, number 9. A Noahide minor, as defined by the sages of one's prevailing culture, is exempt from the Noahide laws, right? So Jews, in our case, if we're looking at number 9, we could relate to number 8, right? I have a tradition, a guideline by the rabbis through prophecy that tells me when are you considered a minor? When are you no longer considered a minor? When you're 13. Just on that, just because it happened last week in the weekly portion, the source of this, some of it derives from Simon and Levi going out to avenge their sister when they do the massacre in Shechem. And it mentions how that they take the weapons, and it took Dinah's brothers, each man took his sword. And they discuss over there that man means 13. And as far as Judaism is concerned, at 13, or what they saw with the brothers was at 13, they managed to understand the offense that happened to their sister, the dynamic it put their father in. And over there, they talk about how he called himself Jacob, but they call him Israel, where they're saying sort of like, you don't get it, Dad. Like, it's not about you anymore. It's about the wrestle you had with the angel. And now you are Israel right now. And so at 13, the Torah is saying they understood the context of what's happening, what their obligation is, and they acted. So that's the age. However, for Noahides or Gentiles, their reference is going to be section 7, like we said, which is you're going to have to go to your local Noahide sage and say, okay, at what age am I not considered a minor anymore? He could come and say, listen, we're living in LA and I'm still paying the tuition of my 23-year-old kid that comes home and keeps crying to me about like his bills. So I don't know if he's definitely in the right state yet to be considered like an adult, so to speak. However, if I'm living in India, my 13-year-old son is already going out, or my 10-year-old son is already going out and fishing and doing XYZ. So that's part of the open conversation that, or dynamic conversation that Noahites could have, which they could decide, or their sage could decide as a culture, as a community, saying from 15, we're taking this on. From 18, we're taking this on. And then in that community, they'll do so, which could mean that in the neighboring community, they decided on 17. And then there's like a year gap difference between both of the groups, but no harm, no foul, so to speak. Was that clear or that confusing? Amazing. And I was just going to ask Antonio, did you understand it as such when you were doing your brief review?
Yeah. So one of the things I'm going to bring up at the end, I guess I could bring it up now, is are there any Noahide sages today? But the other thing is, I know for Jews it's 13. I'm guessing for Gentiles it'd be before 18, I guess.
It could be 13.
It could be, I guess. I don't know.
So the Noahide sage, and like I said earlier, that is it's a live conversation. Again, Brit Olam wants to engage this more hands-on and sort of like really help educate and form a Noahide sage. But it could happen. It could be emergent, right? You could decide right now. I'm just getting deep into this, and I'm learning, and that doesn't mean you have to learn every aspect of the Torah, of course, right? Now, like we said earlier, like Noahides in theory are, or what in the video that Jonathan posted, there's like the prohibition of teaching Torah to Gentiles, right? But clearly, a Noahide sage is going to have to learn Torah, right? And he's also going to have to learn what not to learn, quote unquote. So even that he's going to have to touch upon. So this is really someone that feels like he wants to take on this responsibility, be in contact with someone, through rabbinic Judaism. And, this could turn into a beautiful, beautiful movement. And there's still, again, there's a lot of potential over here. So we don't have necessarily Noahide sages yet. I think that is something that is slowly but surely growing. And I think any true sage probably won't call himself a sage. And that would probably happen, the Noahides of Bangladesh probably know who the main guy is that they ask questions to. Now that guy might ask questions to the rabbis, but I'm sure at this point they've already identified who the shaman is, so to speak. All right, number 10. Whoever is deaf, mute from birth, I think deaf or mute from birth, or mentally incapacitated is exempt from, there's no space over here, exempt from Noahide laws. Okay, so this is the same with Jews. I'll just be politically correct over here. Deaf at that time, or let's say in Jewish terms, it's called cheresh. You can imagine 1,000 years ago, if someone was deaf, people probably thought that he was, not with it, so to speak, or not really engaging with people in the same way. Today, as Sandy could attest, deaf people could be extremely involved, extremely cognizant and aware. So that would not, I would arguably say that, let's say for Sandy's son, this might not be relevant, and he would still be, these things would be applicable to him. However, if someone is really, really not functioning in a certain sense, then, God is very understanding, like I said, right? Their expectation is not, the deaf person or the Down syndrome child has his own beautiful relationship, unique relationship with God. I'm sure in some sense it's more pure and more holy than the brilliant sage, because there's something about a naive and genuine belief in a certain sense, which people in that place could be. And obviously anyone in that condition, may they have a speedy recovery if possible. 11. Noahides are not obligated to give up their lives to avoid violating Noahide laws, with the exception of the prohibition of murder. However, whoever wants to give up his life rather than violate any of these laws is permitted to do so, and in doing so, it sanctifies God's name. Right. So again, just to be clear, this is not a recommendation to go do this. We also have to take into consideration in today's world that there's a lot of depression, there's a lot of mental illness. So even if someone ever thought of doing a move like that, they should think very hard if any of that has to do with where they are mentally or emotionally before they decide to do such a traumatic act. I will mention that the Torah also mentions v'chai bahem, and you lived through them. The Torah is to promulgate life. It doesn't want you to die. In Judaism, we have the 3 cardinal sins, which is murder, idol worship, and adultery. For Noahides, there's only murder. Basically, for the sense of why is your blood any better than anyone else's blood, right? You can't decide to opt to think of yourself as more important. However, idolatry, as we'll discuss in the future, is a little more lax with regards to Gentiles in a certain aspect, and even with regards to even with regards to the the sexual prohibitions, there too, in the Noahide path, there's in theory more flexibility there. In no way is that recommended, though. It's just there's a little more. It's less specific with regards to the Noahides, and seemingly that's why it wasn't considered one of the cardinal sins. However, like the latter portion of this paragraph mentions, that if someone gets to that point where they feel like it's between this or denigrating God's name, and that's what they want to take on from a true loving position to God, then obviously they could do so and they'll be sanctified. And there's the famous story of Rabbi Akiva and the 10 martyrs. But famously, Rabbi Akiva is being, he was caught and executed, sentenced to execution for teaching the Torah. And his skin is being combed or with steel combs that are ripping his skin. And his students ask him, like, is this what you wanted? Is this what's supposed to be? And his attitude is, all my life I was waiting. In the Shema, it says that you loved God with all your heart and all your soul. And I've never had a moment to actually participate in loving God with all my soul. But at this moment, I could finally do that because I was pushed to this place where now I could actually die for this. So obviously it's very, very famous. Just to end that dramatically, there's another martyr that he was beautiful, and the daughter of the daughter of the army general that is executing these rabbis says, he's so beautiful, please give me his skin, because I would like still to look at him. And they're peeling his skin. And when it gets to the point of where he puts on his phylacteries, he yells out to the sky. And the angels look at God and say, Zot Torah v'zos chara, this is Torah and this is its reward? And they're questioning God in a sense. That's very dramatic. And God says, silence. If you guys, this is what I thought about. And if you guys say another word, I'll destroy the whole world. And it's very dramatic in a sense where, like, we're never going to fully understand. This is the question that Job is asking, why these things happen. But in a certain sense, it's God is there answering, but it's an answer that we can't fully comprehend yet or understand. So my point being is that we would like to move to times where we could all participate in Torah through living and not through traumatic deaths, of course. All right. Number 12. Okay. By the way, do anyone need to stop, or could we continue going to? Well, we're basically done. Okay, so we'll wrap this up. Jonathan, can you take us to 12 and 13?
Sure. Halakot added by the sages of Israel, known as rabbinic laws, do not apply to Noahides. Noahide sages. Do you want me to stop, or do you want me to go to 13?
Well, just in 12, it's short. While a lot of these halachot, these pathways, so to speak, have, like, they're logical and advisable, some of them don't relate at all to are not required for Noahides. So a classic example is there are many Jews, Orthodox Jews, that won't drink or have products that have in them what they'll call chalav nochri, Gentile or foreign milk. Okay? Because the reason is you only want to be having milk from a kosher animal, right? So the fear was, if I'm living in Anatevka in the middle of the 1700s, who knows if they didn't milk some random animal and I can't eat this, right? I can't use this drink, or I can't have my Kit Kat. However, there is a famous, and then for many years, people only had Israeli milk, or milk that you have like or milk that is known to be coming from, let's say, a Jewish slaughterhouse or business. However, as technology advanced, as we spoke about in an earlier section over here, some rabbis decided that if the FDA is requiring it to be from a cow in this factory, and that's the permits they got, and there's cameras around, we're not nervous that the Gentile is going to be messing around because he's going to lose his job, he's going to get sued, and that's as if a Jew is like watching him, because one of the options is to have milk that's foreign milk is if while there could be Gentiles working in the business, it's Jewishly owned. And the idea would be like the Jew is watching and making sure that it's happening all above board. Come the sages and say the FDA regulations, permits, and cameras basically create that situation where it's as if the Jew's watching. And that's why it's okay. But to the Noahide, have any milk you want. It's like you don't have to be worried about that. I personally drink foreign milk because of this understanding. But the idea would be that Noahides don't have to take on these specific things that some Jews take on, because there's some rabbis that say they need to do so because it's very specific. Sometimes it's time bound. So one has to be cautious about this, because there could be a sense where a Noahide wants to feel like he's fully immersed and he's fully involved, but then he ends up taking on things that are just completely not relevant. And that's a distinction between what I started the conversation with was, can Noahides take on more mitzvot? That's different than Noahides taking on more specific, intricate halachot of specific things, because some of them really are just not going to be relevant. 13, Jonathan?
Noahide sages accepted among their own people to judge and deliberate in legal matters must be experts in Noahide law, as well as the customary practices and common characteristics of their people. Right.
So it's connecting to what Antonio was saying about like, who are these dudes that are gonna take us there? So we see over here, it breaks it down to 3 points. If we look over here, they need to be accepted among their people. Right. So we need to have some sort of communal recognition who this guy is. It doesn't help us if he says like, I'm the Noahide sage. It doesn't matter to us. Like, we need to recognize you. He needs to be an expert in these things, right? And he has to be well aware of the practices and the common characteristics of his place, right? So that would be like off the bat, Antonio, you could give yourself 3 things over there, right? So if you're in your neighborhood and people around you have recognized you as the guy that knows about the Noahide law, you then are also feel that you've been studying a lot and are an expert in this. I guess who would define you an expert is a question, let's say, towards the rabbis to tell you, like, we see you as someone that's well-versed in this. And then there's, are you real with yourself that you know the characteristics, so embarrassing. Characteristics of your community, and you are aware of, those small little intricate details, right? Because if you're going to take on this kind of responsibility, you want to know on multiple levels how this community is going to react and what they need to hear, right? You might come in and saying, well, I saw in this community, that's what they do. But you recognize and you know the people you're dealing with, it's just not relevant for them at all. So at the very least, it would be that would be like the 3 minimum prerequisites. And then obviously it requires, I would say, someone pious, someone serious, someone sure of themselves. So, and by sure, I don't mean overconfident. I mean someone that knows where they are. So I would say someone that potentially was like, let's say, a Christian 5 minutes ago. I don't know if he's necessarily ready to jump into the deal. Like, now I'm a sage, because one would wonder, like, how did you do such a 180, flip so quickly? All right. Number 14. Noahide law applies to men and women equally. So unlike Judaism, this is quite progressive, and you have to think about this. Obviously, this is in retrospect, but all the way back then. So to all those people that are woke, already at Noah, God was like, listen, it's all good, men and women. Obviously, we recognize that there's a difference. And I would say in Judaism, that difference is, in a certain sense, even stressed and magnified, but I would argue that it's magnified and stressed to elevate both positions and to recognize that both need each other. For the Noahides, while there's a social conversation that has to do with how we recognize men and women, and that's a whole culture war conversation that we're having right now, and that's why it's very good that we have a divine source that we could tether ourselves to. However, with regards to men and women and obligations, the Torah and God's requirement from men and women was equal. So I look at this as like I said, a very progressive section. 15. If an uncertainty arises regarding how to rule in the Noahide law, one may rule according to the lenient opinion. So in Judaism, we have things that are called derabanan and things that are called deoraita. Deoraita, and oraita means the light, is called the Torah. Derabanan means from the rabbanim, from the rabbis. Now, the rabbis dictated through rabbinical dictate that if it's from the Bible, if it's deoraita, then you have to take the more stringent position. However, if it's due to rabbinical opinion, then you could take the more lenient opinion, because the attitude is it's sort of like a double doubt. One doubt is do I know what the right opinion is? The second doubt is the opinion that's given me the authority is not a divine authority, so to speak. It's more rabbinical authority. It doesn't mean that there isn't divine aspects to it. It just means that it's not from the source necessarily. However, for Noahides, there is no distinction. The attitude is you're always taking the lenient opinion, if in doubt. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're in doubt and you want to take onto yourself the more stringent opinion because you've learned and you know and you recognize, or because your Noahide sage feels like, listen, Sandy, we've been doing this for 3 years right now. I think you personally are ready to take on the more stringent opinion. You don't have to. You're not commanded to. Maybe this is what's advisable for you. Maybe this is what's recommended for you. 16. A Noahide who violated one of the Noahide laws inadvertently is exempt from punishment. So here too, I was talking about earlier about the holiness and nature and sort of the requirement or the expectation from the Jew. So Jews can also do things inadvertently. However, when a Jew does that, there's a sense which is God is saying, hey, we've been having this dance for thousands of years. Okay, so I get it that you didn't mean to do this, but at this point, you should have known what's going on and what the requirement is from you. So even if you did it by mistake, you still need to bring a sacrifice to the temple, because it needs to be rectified, because you are being invited to a conversation. And I mean, let's say Jews are being invited to a conversation, which is you have to understand that all is one. And once you recognize all is one, that means your actions affect other actions, and you are aware of that. And you have to be aware of that. And when you are aware of that, there isn't just a mistake. Yeah, you're not a bad person, but there were consequences to that, and you have to take that into consideration. However, for the Gentile, there's a sense which is, yes, we're all connected, but you made a mistake. You didn't mean to do so purposely. You're not reading the text and diving into the relationship, so to speak, at that level of focus. And that's why if you weren't required to see all the pixels, we can't blame you for not recognizing how one pixel affected the other, because you're still zoomed out. And as far as you're concerned, the picture is clear. But like I said earlier, the more you advance, the more you get involved. Obviously, if there's a sense of more responsibility, you can decide to be taking on more. As your relationship grows and you feel that, like, I'm getting closer to God, then God probably has more expectations from you. Different from commandments, though, right? So there's like a legalistic term we have to understand over here, which is that if I'm commanded or not. But whether it's advisable to take on more once you become more serious, that is a separate question. And Antonio, if you could wrap us up beautifully on number 17.
The 27th day of the month of Mar Heshvan is the day on which Noah left the ark and received the Noahide laws. Therefore, several Noahide communities accustom themselves to mark this day as a festival of the nations.
Exactly. So this is a nice little idea. It would be nice if Jews did this as well. I don't think Jews some of them are aware of it, but like it's not on the mind of many Orthodox Jews. There actually was a party last year in Brit that talked about this, but again, this is a slow process. I would imagine in the next 10 years or so, this becomes something that's like more notable. Like I know this sounds like a small detail, but I imagine a world where my daughter in school eventually is going to have, in her yearly schedule, there's going to be, that we have when the Memorial Day is, we know when all the holidays is. So I could see this being as one of the holidays as well that the school recognizes and talks about. And wouldn't that be a fantastic, fantastic world to live in? I think that is the end of this chapter. And next week we dive into the real. We're moving into the knowledge of God, laws of idolatry, which is actually starting to dive into the 7 laws. So we had the intro, we had the prerequisites and sort of framing, and now we're diving in with that. So I guess for next week, let's go through 13, through chapter 3. I don't know if we're going to finish chapter 3 next week, but we'll definitely go through most of it, and then we'll continue on. Yeah. If there's any questions, Jonathan, Antonio, Sandy.
Yeah, with that last point, be sidestepping the prohibition to create a festival for
Again?
Noahides.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Because isn't there something for Noahides where we're not supposed to create a festival for ourselves?
You're not supposed. First of all, this is not a festival for yourself. Here, you're being told that this is a festival that like Jews recognize as. I'm just saying it's not prevalent because people don't. Most rabbis don't dive into Noahide laws. They might not even be aware of this necessarily. But this is not something that the Noahides are taking on for themselves. Rather, this is something that was given to you and recognized by the sages and Jewish law. Specifically with the holidays, there's a question. Festivals, there's a question of if you're doing it once or you're doing it, or it becomes like a repetitive thing. There's ramifications again of confusion, right? I see Antonio keeping Sukkot every day. I think Antonio's Jewish. My daughter gets really into Antonio's son, and then I have to have this whole conversation where he's really a Noahide. What does this mean? So there's always that fear. Again, I think there's still place for interpretation as this thing progresses. If rabbis decide to are in a position where they feel comfortable enough in recognizing said Noahides and then saying on their own accord, we permit you to do 1, 2, 3 because we're no longer in a place where we're going to have this confusion. But for right now, generally speaking, there's a consensus around that the Noahide laws are not something that you should. The festivals are not something that you should be doing. Again, a distinction between do I have to? There's you shouldn't be doing and me telling you not to do it. Right? I'm not required to stop you at this point of our relationship. However, once the Messiah comes or Israel has like full authority over, if you can imagine, let's say Brit Olam becomes recognized by all the Noahide movements as, let's say, the authority in Jerusalem, so to speak. When you get to that point, you could start having a conversation where then that authority could speak out and tell other Noahides, don't do this. However, at this position where it's still sort of dispersed and there isn't a central point, there is more leniency with these things happening if they're happening from a honest place. And then there's another sub discussion. If you kept that festival, some rabbis will say there's no reward to that. Some rabbis will say, while it's not an ideal, there's still a reward for that action. It's different than the reward a Jew would get that's obligated to, but you still receive some sort of reward because at the end of the day, like we were saying, if you're coming from a honest place, that is still an expression of your longing to connect to God. However, it's important to recognize the difference, and it's hard to do this mentally, and if you do it every year, if you do Passover every year, at some point your son might think we're obligated to do so. And it would be very hard for you to constantly mention, remember, we're doing this because we want to do this, not because we're told to do this. And when we go through the prayer book, we're going to see that the terminology over there is different than the terminology I use, where I say I was commanded to do so, and you're going to have other terminology.
I have another odd question then.
Sure.
Has there been, or do you think there could potentially be then within Noahide communities where children are raised with those questions in the back of their mind, more children who want to take on becoming Jewish? Because if they've been in a family where they're doing something regularly and they're starting to say, look, this is just, what am I? Has there been any, well, maybe not yet, but does that lead to potentially saying, look, I'm just going to clarify this so that I don't have to keep explaining this. I'm going to become Jewish.
So yes, and you could be sure that there are going to be some people that elect at some point to be like, you know what? People that are going to see it as Judaism light are going to want to come and say, like, let me go do the full Monty. However, and what we discussed in the past is it's not Judaism light. Right? It's just, and that's why it could be that, and this is as the community grows, if they're educated in the proper context, they're not necessarily going to be sold a version where they're like, we're doing this, but we're not obligated, and it's confusing. Rather, it could be taught in a sense that it's a lot more natural, and someone's doing this, and the language that's used is, we are being invited to have a conversation with God, right? If you can start using that term, your kids are going to grow up with the term of saying, this is the invitation, not that this is a requirement.
No, and I was trying to be very careful how I asked it, because I've been thinking about it all the way back to when we were talking about children or those with various disabilities being obligated or not obligated, and how, because I had a conversation ages ago when I really didn't have a context in which to think about it, of one of the people that I knew through Jacob's Deaf School was a Christian woman who was deaf, who married a Jewish man who was deaf, and she became Jewish because it's a very small community to be deaf. And so she was trying to explain to people, no, it's super important if I'm marrying him that I also be Jewish, and because, that I hadn't heard of Noahides, I hadn't heard of any of this. And it was like, oh, well, that's an interesting choice, because most people that I would have known at that point were in a Christian context, and they're like, why would she do that? Like, what is that? And I'm going, that's super important is what that is, but it's hard to explain.
I would say Judaism actually would, if someone is converting because of marriage or love purposes, that's not permissible according to Orthodox conversion laws.
I don't know what their conversation was. I just know
understood. I'm pointing out that it's not enough that you want to do it for social reasons or because it's important. It's because put your wife aside, put your husband aside. This is between you and the creator of the universe. And you feel that there's, your soul is yearning for more responsibility and more connectivity. What I'm saying, what we're saying here
at some point.
Yeah. What we're saying is here that the Noahide path should be offering that as well. You could dive very deep. You could go very wide and have a very, very genuine and real relationship with God. And it's also not in a vacuum. It's not like, well, now I'm a Noahide and that's the end of the discussion with Jews. Like, there's no reason why this can't continue, right? Where there's joint learning, joint conversation, cross-pollination. And that's why there's also the Ger Toshav. There's the resident alien, right? That's someone that says, listen, I'm not Jewish, but I'm totally with these people. I'm in the land of these people. I could own property in the Holy Land. And that's, a clear invitation where God's saying, like, yeah, I love you. I want you to be here. I want you to chill with them. But again, like, I didn't require you to do X, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.